You're listening to Voices of Customer Experience. I'm your host, Mary Drumond, and on this podcast, we shine the spotlight on individuals who are making a difference in customer experience. We also proudly bring you the very best of customer experience, behavior economics, data analytics, and design. Make sure to subscribe or follow us on social for updates. Voices of Customer Experience is brought to you by Worthix. Discover your worth at worthix.com. Patrick Campbell is the co-founder and CEO of ProfitWell, the industry standard software for helping companies like Atlassian, Autodesk, Meetup, and Lyft with their monetization and retention strategies. ProfitWell also provides a turnkey solution that powers the subscription financial metrics for over 8,000 subscription companies. Prior to ProfitWell, Patrick led the strategic initiatives for Boston-based Gemvara and was an economist at Google and the U.S. intelligence community. Thanks for coming on, Patrick. It's great to have you.
Hey, it's good to be here.
I've been looking through your material, watching some of the content that you post on your vlog. It's called Protect the Hustle, right?
Yeah, that's the new podcast we came out, and we've been publishing lots of fun content for a while now. But that's the newest one.
Awesome. Well, for our listeners who might not be familiar with your work and what you do, can you give us a bit of a rundown of your background and what you do for a living, what your educational background is, and what your mission is in, changing the world?
Yeah, definitely. So my personal background's in econometrics and math. I was born in a small town in Wisconsin, one of those towns with more cows than people, and so definitely shaped me. And maybe that's why I went towards the numbers because there weren't a lot of people. And so yeah, I think to kind of speed things up, and not go too deep into the history. I started my career working in the intelligence community in DC, and then ended up going to work at Google. And basically both places like really early in my career. And so I was doing, kind of grunt work around economic modeling and a little bit of sales and a little bit of fun stuff. And so left there, worked at a company called Gemvara, which was a e-commerce, like a custom e-commerce company. So basically you could design your perfect ring or perfect piece of jewelry with all different types of gemstones or colors of metals and things like that. It was kind of like a gemstone focused Blue Nile, if you're familiar with the market. Mm-hmm. And that's when I kind of got the itch around, pricing and customer research, because we would basically focus in on, making small changes to our pricing or making small changes to our, kind of our stack. And then we would see these big swings in revenue. And so that's kind of where I got the customer research or customer development bug kind of bit me. And then, founded ProfitWell. We used to be called Price Intelligently, which is essentially a suite of products that help subscription companies with their growth. And we have a free product that basically gives you your subscription metrics. So you plug it in and you get your active usage, your MRR, all that kind of fun stuff. Mm-hmm. And then we make money by selling products that help with pricing and help with your retention and things like that. And so that's kind of the quick and rambly version of where I come from and where I am now.
Well, I heard you mention, you're probably the perfect person to be on this podcast because that's exactly what we love talking about. We love talking about customer research and how that ties into not only revenue and profit, but how that also kind of, how can I say this, connects to all the other departments inside organizations. Mm. And one thing that we really like doing is it kind of widening the funnel so that it's not just customer experience people talking to other customer experience people, but kind of broadening that view and taking a different angle or a different perspective of how the entire company or the entire organization can benefit from consumer research. So that's why I think you're perfect. In your most recent episode, I believe, of the blog, you talked specifically about customer research and how it can be used to shorten the cycles in SaaS companies. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. That was something we went deep on. And I think it's, super crucial around like feedback cycles in general. A lot of us, we kind of guess and check our way to success when in reality, you aren't going to know if it's going to work or not until you truly ship it. But what you can do is realize, kind of hedge that guessing and checking by doing research, not only from a customer perspective, but also, on the market, competitors and things like that.
You had Steve Blank on the podcast talking a little bit about that. And he's a Silicon Valley guy, right? Tell me a little bit about what he does and the message that he got across.
Yeah, so Steve Blank is he's kind of one of these luminaries of Silicon Valley. So he's been building products for decades at this point. I don't want to age him too much, but he's kind of the the father or the godfather of kind of the customer development kind of method, but also kind of really just harping on how important customer research is. And the whole thesis there, and I kind of got into that already, is that because the market is starting to move so quickly, mainly because software and technology and businesses have just gotten quote unquote easier to build, or at least relatively easier compared to 10 years ago. Because of that, essentially what's happened is that you need to start building the right things. And it's harder and harder to figure out what the right things are. And it's harder and harder to figure out who the right customer is. And so because of that, that's where it's so important to make sure that you're validating or invalidating your hypotheses in the business that you're building. So you're doing that research, and it doesn't always have to be like surveys or interviews or things like that. It can be looking at your data and understanding where people are coming from. But that's Steve's big thing, which is, you got to talk to the customer. You got to quote, get out of the building, as he talks about, and kind of go from there.
That's interesting because it reminds me of an episode we did this season with Dr. Nami Vadir, and she works at the Center for Deliberate Innovation at Georgia Tech.
Oh, cool.
And what they do you know about them? Have you heard about them?
No, I haven't. That sounds like something I should check out, though.
Yeah, they're awesome. And for our listeners, it's episode 7, if whomever wants to check it out. What they do is they actually created a method or a process to try to decrease the fail index for startups. And they do this through research. So they encourage startups to go out on the street and ask questions. And it's really interesting. I'm not going to spoil it for people, but it talks about they created a method to keep whomever is doing the research from falling into the trap of biases. So they actually have a method that they wrote out, and it's pretty neat. They based a lot of their studies on Daniel Kahneman's book Thinking Fast and Slow, and the biases that he explores in that book. So they actually created an entire method around it, and there are some pretty brilliant minds working on that. So I encourage everybody to check it out.
That's cool.
But that's something that I heard on your podcast as well, was talking about how research starts with a hypothesis. And you can confirm that for me since you're an expert. Most research starts off with a hypothesis, and then you look to confirm that hypothesis through experiments, in this case, through talking to people and asking questions. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's kind of following like most research, or at least in what I've found and what I've seen be successful around, running some sort of a research process. You're just kind of following the scientific method or some variation of the scientific method that you learned back in probably middle school or maybe even earlier in elementary school. And it really just kind of comes down to establishing what you think, it's a hypothesis, and putting a framework around how can we get data to support or to refute, or at least take away support for that particular idea. And then based on that, what we can do is basically understand that, okay, like this decision that we were going to spend a bunch of time on, it's actually the right decision. Or this decision we were going to spend a bunch of time on, it is not the right decision. Because when you're building a company and when you're making decisions, you're normally fighting time more than anything else.
Right.
Money is obviously something that, can come into play, but normally time and money are almost equal in a lot of ways.
Right. No, I absolutely agree. And I think that that's probably the most traditional way it's done. But I ask you this because we've heard some people from academia and other companies as well that have begun to remove that step from the process. So they take away the whole idea of starting with a hypothesis. and they go straight to the data. And they do this, and then you say, how do you do this? Because you need the questions, right? You need to form the questions. And what they try to do is have extremely open-ended questions that are kind of led on by the respondent themselves. And you allow people to kind of just talk in a more unstructured way. And you then look at the data. And this is something that's only possible now because we've got big data and we've got data analysis to a degree that didn't exist before, right? And that way, what you're able to get is just the voice of the customer, totally void of our biases or even company biases. So instead of the customer answering the questions that we want the answers to because it's relevant to our business, they just talk about what they like, what they think is relative, what they think is valuable, where their expectations are with the market. And then we interpret that data and take out what's relative and then apply that. What do you think of that process?
Yeah, it's a really good. So that's kind of the standard, or the at least a similar framework or process that we've heard and talked about. I think one really important thing to kind of point out, though, I think, is all data is going to have some sort of bias, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to have, some sort of, there's a location bias. You only ask people, around you in Boston, or like that's where we're located. Or it's going to have some bias because, they're not exactly in the same environment through which they're going to make that decision. Or they're right after they made that decision, or, a whole host of things. And I think that we get caught up a lot in bias because bias is important, but folks who, maybe, aren't academic or anything like that, they kind of think like, oh, this is just going to be biased, so I shouldn't do it at all. That's what a lot of people that we run into end up thinking. And in reality, the secret is more around always understanding the limits of your data. So if I'm going to make and I mentioned this in the podcast, if I'm going to make a $10 million decision, I probably shouldn't make that decision off of just like 10 random conversations that, didn't have a lot of data and were very open-ended, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I probably shouldn't have a research process that starts with me making very specific surveys or very specific, environments, because I'm putting my own bias into what I think should be out there. So
Right.
the long story short, I think that framework makes a ton of sense. We recommend, starting with that hypothesis, and then it doesn't always have to flow this way, but getting some qualitative information, and then, if you're not satisfied or you feel like you need some quantitative, going out and getting it. But I think that the biggest thing I would recommend to people listening is your job is to understand the limits of your data, and depending on the gravity of the decision, eliminate and reduce as much bias as you can, essentially.
So that's part of the job of the data scientist, who's looking at that information and being able to say, hey, this is compromised. Either there are too few responses or it's too limited. Or also trying to, I don't know, maybe find some value in what is there and what you have. I mean, we're talking about companies here of all sizes. In your case, SaaS companies that sometimes have tons and tons of customers and other times are just getting started. So not everyone has access to big, huge numbers of respondents, right?
Yeah, I think that's right, but I also think that there's a pretty healthy environment or ecosystem out there for you to get respondents, right? And one thing I think I find when I talk to people about customer research is that if you truly cannot get respondents for something, like you truly cannot find them, you probably don't have a great market, because then that means it's going to be that much harder to go out and try to sell someone something versus, buying them a coffee or getting them on the phone or getting a LinkedIn introduction to them or something like that. And so I would say, like, overall, I think the biggest thing that I would think about is, where can you go to where your customers are? Now, there's some very natural environments. So, if you're selling a retail product, obviously, like going to a store and like talking to them. There's like more natural things for a business to business kind of environment, which is, find them on LinkedIn, getting introductions, starting a blog, contacting email subscribers. And then there's, quicker but more expensive ways, which is to use these market panelist companies. And so
Right.
you can get access to anyone from, I say a soccer mom or dad in the middle of Kansas all the way to a Fortune 500 CIO in Europe. One costs very differently than the other. But it's one of those things that it's relatively easy nowadays to get relatively cheap responses from people And there's, to me, there's no excuse for not being able to do your research. You might not be able to do the amount of research you want to do, but you should be at least get able to do some, if that makes sense.
Voices of Customer Experience is brought to you by Worthix. If you're interested in customer experience, behavior economics, or data science, follow Worthix on social media or subscribe to our blog for the best content on the web. How about the idea that people are no longer that open or that tolerant of answering surveys? You know, my personal opinion is that maybe we had a whole generation of people who had to answer really bad surveys. They were either way too long, or the questions were irrelevant, or it was questions that the company should already know. There was an example very recently in the customer experience industry of a person who took a flight on Emirates, and the survey was 30 minutes long. And it was just exhausting. And the person went through the entire process just to prove a point and screenshotted every single, screen and said, this is absurd. They're asking me for my email. They're asking me which class I'm in, but they know exactly which seat I'm on. So they should have access to all this information. He said, I'm a loyalty member. You have all this information, yet you took up 10 minutes of my time asking questions that were totally irrelevant that you should already know. Do you think that this is an epidemic? Do you think this is really happening where people are like, nope, not going to answer surveys anymore. Too long, waste of time?
I know exactly what you're talking about. And I love to talk about this because surveys don't work. Well, what's the last survey you sent? Well, it was 45 questions long. It was emailed to you.
Right.
The first question was, what's your email address, right? So it's just kind of an intense, problem where we've kind of trained people to the fact that we're not going to respect, your time. Therefore, like, why should I, use my time to give you some value? And so I think that we have affected the industry, like we as just operators out there looking for customer research. But I think you can retrain people pretty easily. And that's by sending, if you're not going to compensate them, and when I say compensate, I mean like compensate on an individual basis, not like, hey, we're going to give away a prize or something like that. But if you're not going to compensate, you can do a 30 to 60 second survey and be super clear in the subject line as well as in the actual email copy that, hey, this is 30 to 60 seconds. The problem is if you go over 60 seconds, typically your response rate typically does go down. And then when you go over 4 minutes, if it's not compensated, normally what ends up happening is the quality goes down.
Right.
At least in the data that we've seen, and we've sent probably about 40 million of these things at this point, because one of our pieces of software is very survey based. And so I think it's one of those things where, long story short, I think you can retrain people that you're going to basically respect their time, and then get them into a mode of being more than happy to share feedback. Now, there's other ways to receive feedback, even through a survey, right? You can do it on the site. You can do it in a lot of different places, but I think you hit the nail on the head. But the biggest thing is you got to respect the respondent's time.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that, as a continuation, as a follow-up, do you think that companies are proactively changing the way they're doing surveys? Or do you think there are a lot, like the airline I mentioned, that just don't care, that just they have all these questions that they want the answers to, and maybe someone is just being lazy and they're like, we're going to ask them questions anyways, we might as well put them all in there, right? What do you think is the tendency of the market at this stage?
Oh, I think it's pure laziness. And I think that what ends up happening is a lot of people, they burn their people out both internally and externally. And so I don't know. I think that I do think the world of kind of surveys and research is getting better, mainly because the tools are getting better. If you think about, even just like SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics or some of these other survey tools that are out there, they've definitely gotten, much cleaner. But I will say that for the most part, I think that we're probably still kind of in the same mode that we've always been. And hopefully that is going to shift. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't know if I have enough evidence to suggest that we are getting better. I know there's a lot of companies that are getting better, but I don't know if it's a global trend quite yet.
Right. Sometimes when speaking to people who are conducting surveys, there's a large frustration that I have, which is if someone opens your survey and says, hey, you know what, I'm going to take the time to answer that, that shows a lot of it shows that the customer really takes value in your brand, either because they want to give you negative feedback of something that's really bothering them and they want to fix it. So they're trying to give the company an opportunity to solve the issue. Or when it's to give positive feedback, which is a lot more rare, it's because they really they feel passionate and they're an evangelist somehow, and they want to stimulate or encourage the company to keep doing well. So when you get a survey response, it's someone who actually cares about the brand, I feel, and they're doing it, especially when they do it for free. This is so valuable. Companies should treat this with the utmost respect. And when they don't, I feel like it backfires. It has the adverse effect where you're actually alienating your customer and decreasing their satisfaction rate because you're telling them that you don't care about them as a customer and you don't care that they're taking the time to answer you and give you feedback. What do you think?
I mean, it is about that experience, right? And I think what ends up happening is we kind of feel like a survey isn't, well, we think that about a lot of things, right? Like, oh, our receipts aren't part of the experience. Our transactional emails aren't part of the experience. A survey isn't part of the experience. Like we somehow believe that this experience is suspended in like a animated way somehow for just the, when they're using our product, right? When in reality, it's everything around it. And so, yeah, I think that the survey is a perfect opportunity to kind of defend that experience. And to do that, you need to make sure that obviously you're not kind of attacking the wrong pieces and wasting people's time.
Right. How valuable is customer insight for SaaS companies that have subscription plans that depend on that retention, on building up their user base more and more?
It's hard to put like a metric on it, but I will say that overall it's extremely valuable, and the reason is because the cycles, and I talked about this earlier, the cycles through which we're building products or we're acquiring customers online are getting shorter and shorter. And the reason that they're getting shorter and shorter is because technology is no longer the barrier to building a company. It used to be the huge barrier. And if you're working on some really fancy stuff like nuclear fusion or something like that, obviously technology is a huge, barrier still. I think for most of us who are building like a subscription company, the product needs to be good just because there's so much other product out there now. But the swing has happened where all of a sudden the actual product isn't the limiting factor as much as it is finding that customer, acquiring that customer, making that customer happy. And so you gotta understand that customer, because everything in your business, from your sales and your marketing all the way down to your finance and operations teams, is used to either drive a type of customer to a point of conversion or to justify and rationalize why that product and that price should be continued to be paid or to continue to be used. And so if you don't know who that customer is, there's no way in hell you're going to know how to price, what to build, how to keep them, and ultimately how to make them satisfied with your product.
Not only that, but what they perceive as value in the current market, which is changing so very quickly, right? So like disruption and innovation is no longer something rare. It's no longer a rare occurrence. It's actually happening on a day-to-day basis, right? So you can lose your customer to innovation or disruption at any given moment, and you have to be able to keep up with how their expectations are changing throughout their life cycle with you. No?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you something. After, deciding that you need to do research and creating your survey, asking the questions, you do need to think about methodology. You actually probably need to think about methodology first. And there are a couple methodologies out there that are more traditional. Others are more innovative. Worthix, my company, we have survey methodology as well. But some of the main players in the market nowadays that have the strongest following, you have companies like Net Promoter Score or customer satisfaction, those methodologies. You recently talked about NPS and how that correlates to retention, which is something really important in your market. Can you tell us a little bit about your research and what it found?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the big thing is in our research was basically finding out that Netflix isn't, or Netflix, NPS. I don't know why I just said Netflix. I just think Net Promoter Score, Netflix. Oh my gosh, that's how much Netflix is in the brand of our world, I guess. Anyways, what's interesting about NPS is it's not an absolute God metric. And what I mean by that is we found that NPS does not correlate, meaning as NPS goes up, it does not automatically mean that your retention is going to be better or that businesses that have higher NPS are going to have higher retention. Now, there's a subtle point here, which is when you have upper quartile, so really, really good NPS, you tend to also have really, really good retention, but that's not correlation. That's just, a phenomenon that's happening. And so it's a subtlety for folks who are maybe not as data inclined, but basically what it means is that there isn't like a 1-to-1 correlation or even close to one as your NPS goes up. And yeah, I kind of hit a little bit of a hornet's nest with that study, mainly because NPS has become this like dogma within a lot of organizations. And I wasn't saying that NPS isn't important. I think NPS, if used correctly, and actually it's exceptionally important and exceptionally useful on both a individual score basis, but also when you segment it and we study it and compare it over time and things like that. But I think that a lot of people who don't go to those extremes, they just kind of think, oh, we have NPS of this, our product must be amazing, everything must be great. When in reality, there's a lot of other indicators that you have to look at to understand if your product truly is great.
Well, I think it's because it's just a metric that people started throwing around to answer any questions that they couldn't actually pinpoint. They're like, oh, our NPS is this, oh, our NPS is that. But let's
totally
in your research, which were the areas that you found that NPS was not actually useful, and which were the ones that you found were extremely useful?
So overall, I think with NPS, it's very useful when you track it over time. It's very useful when obviously if there's signal where if someone gives you a low NPS score, you can reach out to them or treat them a little bit differently than if someone gives you a high NPS score. I think in addition to that, it's extremely useful for things like when you segment things down. So the NPS of people who are using this feature versus the NPS of people who are using that feature. I think NPS in aggregate is pretty not useful. Like most data, like any data that you look at in aggregate, it's typically not that useful because, you're not learning, differences and dissonance that occurs within the data, and you have to segment it down to get value. So I think those are some of the use cases that I think you can use, but I don't know. I want to live in a world where we kind of get beyond NPS, not because NPS is necessarily the, bad. I think it's just more around the fact that NPS is actually one of those things that when you look at it, it's like, oh, if we built, certain models, we could do so much better. There's so many different signals that suggest retention or better monetization or, good retention or all types of different things. And it's just that, we as humans, we typically like, one number or one kind of blunt instrument to measure things, when in reality, building a custom model for every single company out there, that's hard, right? And it takes work, and
yeah,
maybe it doesn't necessarily get us much more than NPS would, but I think as technology gets better and we're now able to measure things on a much, much better basis, that's allowing us to basically evolve in terms of how we measure sentiment and things like that. And that's the future, I think. I don't know how close that future is, but I think that eventually, just by the nature of being able to look at other data, we'll move beyond something like NPS.
That leads me to my last question, which is regarding cold data versus hot data. Lots of times, when companies have the initiative to survey their customers, by the time they start collecting the responses, or by the time they've processed the responses and actually created metrics on it, that data is no longer hot. It's cold. It reflects the past. What are some solutions to keep that data constantly hot, especially in the market that we live in where change comes so quickly? Is there some way that we can have like a continuous cycle of fresh data?
Totally. I think if you use certain products, right? So there's a ton of products out there. Obviously, you guys know a couple of them. So I think it's one of those things. There's a ton of products out there, and that's really the secret. Is you got to be doing this on a continual basis. It's something where if you treat this as a project every X months, it's going to end up failing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why it's so important to kind of keep things moving. And when I think kind of overall about how things kind of work inside organizations, you got to start small. If you start, hey, we're going to solve our pricing. Hey, we're going to fix this big thing. You're going to end up failing for a whole host of reasons, much of them not related to the data or anything. And so I would start small, just start, NPS has a lot of its own problems, but just start collecting NPS. And then that's going to cause more questions. And then start doing exit surveys when someone churns, and then start doing a whole host of other things, but just kind of keep things moving essentially.
So get started. And once you get started, once you start digging, you'll start uncovering new things that'll lead you to dig deeper.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think that that's our last question for today, but we really appreciate you taking the time to come on, Patrick. What are some ways that our listeners can reach you or follow you and get to know more about your insights and listen to what you have to say?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. We post a lot of our content through my LinkedIn profile, just at Patrick Campbell. You can also follow me on the Protect the Hustle podcast that we recently launched, and it's going well. Or just pc@profitwell.com. We publish a lot, and I'm always more than happy to kind of help anyone. Might take a little bit for me to get back to you, but always happy to help.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to Voices of Customer Experience. If you'd like to hear more or get a full podcast summary, visit the episode details page or go to blog.worthix.com/podcasts. This episode of Voices of Customer Experience was hosted and produced by Mary Drumond, co-hosted by James Conrad, and edited by Nick Gomez. Blog copy and summary by Emma Waldron.